A cold November night had draped New Jersey in an eerie silence. At precisely 11:30, the sky over Bedminster shimmered unnaturally, as though the stars were twitching in panic. Chris Dunham, a local journalist, leaned against his rusted sedan parked on the shoulder of Route 206, his eyes glued to a point above the Picatinny Arsenal. For weeks, residents had reported inexplicable sightings, drones maneuvering with unnatural precision, beams of light cutting through the night sky. Yet, no official had offered an explanation. As Chris adjusted the zoom lens of his camera, a piercing hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. His heart raced as a formation of 6 drones emerged, each perfectly aligned. They hovered, lights flashing in sync, before scattering with impossible speed toward the direction of Trump's golf course in Bedminster. "Did you get that?" The voice startled Chris. He spun around to see Danny, his intern, bundled in a hoodie and scarf, her breath visible in the frigid air. Danny had insisted on tagging along, her curiosity rivaling Chris's. "Barely. These things move faster than anything I've ever seen." Chris replayed the footage on his camera. The lights were there, but their sharp movements rendered them little more than streaks against the dark canvas of the night. "They're not just drones, are they?" Danny's tone wavered. Before Chris could answer, his phone vibrated. It was a text from an anonymous number. The message was short but chilling. "Leave this alone. This isn't what you think." Chris showed the text to Danny, his brow furrowed. "Looks like we've got someone watching us." Danny's face strained of color. "Who would even know we're here?" Chris shrugged, his defiance hiding his unease. "Whoever they are, they don't want this story coming out, which means we're on to something big." Across the state, in a small dive bar near Newark, retired Marine Jack Henderson nursed a whiskey. The old soldier had seen his fair share of classified operations, but the images on the TV screen above the bar caught his attention. A shaky video taken by a hiker in the Watchung Reservation showed a large shadow gliding just above the tree line. The newscaster described it as a possible military drone test. Jack knew better. "That's no damn drone," he muttered under his breath. A man sitting 2 stools down turned to Jack. His face was pale, his voice barely a whisper. "They've been watching us, ever since they opened the vault." Jack froze. "What vault?" The man glanced around nervously. "In the arsenal. They found something they weren't supposed to." Before Jack could press for more details, the man bolted from the bar, leaving behind a crumpled 20 on the counter. Jack's instincts kicked in. This wasn't a coincidence. Back on Route 206, Chris and Danny decided to follow the trail of the drones. As they drove, the GPS in Chris's car began glitching, showing random coordinates. Then, the car radio crackled to life. "This is a warning. Do not proceed," a distorted voice commanded. Chris hit the brakes, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What the hell?" Danny grabbed his arm. "Chris, maybe we should listen. This is getting dangerous." But Chris's curiosity outweighed his fear. "If someone's trying this hard to scare us off, we're not stopping." As they rounded the bend near a dense patch of forest, they saw it, a faint glow pulsating deep among the trees. Chris pulled over, and both of them crept toward the source of the light, their breaths shallow. In the clearing, they froze. A massive, disc-shaped object was partially buried in the ground, surrounded by what appeared to be military personnel in unmarked uniforms. Above, the drones hovered in perfect formation. Chris reached for his camera, but Danny grabbed his hand. "Don't," she whispered. "They'll see us." Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground. The object's surface began to ripple like liquid metal, and a beam of blue light shot skyward. The soldiers scattered, shouting commands into their radios, but the drones remained still as though awaiting further instructions. Danny's grip tightened. "Chris, we need to go. Now." Chris nodded, but as they turned to leave, the beam of light shifted direction, locking onto them. The beam enveloped Chris and Danny, its bluish-white intensity freezing them in place. Chris's instincts screamed to run, but his body refused to cooperate. His pulse thundered in his ears as a strange warmth coursed through him. Next to him, Danny's breath came in sharp gasps, and then, as abruptly as it appeared, the light vanished. Chris collapsed to his knees, gripping the damp earth. Danny stumbled backward, her face pale. What just happened?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Chris forced himself upright, his knees wobbling. "I don't know. Are you okay?" Danny nodded weakly, but her eyes darted around the clearing. Chris, the soldiers, they're gone. Chris turned and felt his blood run cold. The clearing that had moments ago been teeming with soldiers and the mysterious drones was now silent and empty. The disc-shaped object still rested in the ground, but its glow had dimmed to a faint shimmer and the drones were nowhere to be seen. Did they just vanish? Danny whispered. Before Chris could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. With shaking hands, he pulled it out. The same anonymous number had sent another text. "You should have left. Now they know you." Danny read the message over his shoulder, her face contorting in fear. "They know us? Chris, we have to get out of here." Chris nodded, but something in him refused to abandon the scene without answers. He pulled out his camera, adjusting the focus to capture the faint glow of the object. The lens clicked softly, breaking the eerie silence. "We'll leave in a minute," he said, voice low. "I need a few shots. If this thing disappears too?" A deep, guttural noise cut through the air, stopping Chris mid-sentence. It was a sound unlike anything he'd heard. Part growl, part mechanical hum. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. "Chris, something's moving," Danny hissed, pointing toward the object. The disk's surface began to ripple again, and an opening emerged in its center, jagged and irregular, as though the metal had torn itself apart. From the shadows within, a figure began to emerge. Its silhouette was humanoid but unnaturally elongated, its limbs bending at odd angles as it stepped into the moonlight. Danny let out a muffled scream, and Chris instinctively raised his camera. Through the viewfinder, he caught a glimpse of the creature's face, or what passed for one. Its eyes were large and reflective, emitting a faint green glow, and its skin shimmered with the same liquid metal quality as the disc. "Don't move," Chris whispered, lowering the camera. "Maybe it doesn't see us." But the creature turned its head sharply in their direction, as if hearing his words. For a moment, it just stood there, staring. Then it let out a low, resonant hum that vibrated in Chris's chest. Danny grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "Chris, run." They bolted toward the tree line, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, the creature let out a high-pitched screech, and the guttural noise intensified. Chris dared a glance over his shoulder and saw the thing moving toward them with terrifying speed, its limbs bending unnaturally as it gave chase. "This way," Danny shouted, veering off the path toward a cluster of boulders. Chris followed, his lungs burning with each step. They dove behind the rocks, pressing themselves into the shadows. Chris held his breath, the sound of his heartbeat deafening in his ears. The creature stopped a few yards away, scanning the area with its glowing eyes. Its head tilted slightly, and the hum it emitted grew softer, almost questioning. For a moment, Chris thought it might move on, but then the hum abruptly stopped. The creature turned its head directly toward their hiding spot. Chris's mind raced. It knows we're here. But before the creature could close the distance, a brilliant flash of white light erupted from the disc. The creature screeched and twisted violently, retreating toward the object. The disc pulsed once, twice, and then both it and the creature disappeared in a silent implosion of light and air. Chris and Danny stayed frozen behind the rocks, their bodies trembling. Finally, Danny broke the silence. "Chris, what the hell is going on?" Chris shook his head, struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. "I don't know, but someone's going to great lengths to keep it hidden." In a sterile office far from the forest, a man in a dark suit watched a live feed of the event on a wall of monitors. The room was filled with the hum of advanced machinery, and several others, dressed in military uniforms, stood behind him. "They saw too much," one of the officers said. "We need to bring them in." The man in the suit shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see where they go." The officer frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, this could compromise." "Enough," the man snapped. "They're not running from us, they're running from it. Let them lead us to what it wants." Back in the forest, Chris and Danny staggered back to the car. Danny's hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, but the car roared to life, and they sped down Route 206 without a word. Finally, Chris broke the silence. "We need to figure out what they're hiding at Picatinny." Danny shot him a look, her face pale. "Are you serious? Chris, whatever that was back there, it's not just some secret military tech. It's something else." "Exactly," Chris said, gripping the wheel tightly. And if we don't tell people about it, who will? As they drove, neither noticed the black SUV that had been following them since they left the clearing. The hum of the road filled the car as Chris and Danny sped through the empty streets, their adrenaline still high. The dark shapes of trees lining Route 206 seemed to close in on them, casting shadows that felt alive. Danny kept glancing at the rearview mirror, her unease growing. "Chris," she said finally, her voice strained, "there's a car behind us. It's been there since we left the clearing." Chris tightened his grip on the steering wheel and checked his mirrors. The black SUV was barely visible in the distance, its headlights off, but it followed every turn they made with uncanny precision. "Stay calm," Chris said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." Danny shot him a look. "Coincidence? After everything we just saw? You can't seriously believe that." Chris hesitated. She was right. Whoever or whatever was behind them wasn't just out for a midnight drive. He pushed the gas pedal harder, and the sedan surged forward, its old engine groaning in protest. Several miles away, in the heart of the Picatinny arsenal, alarms blared. A team of technicians worked furiously in a high-tech control room, their screens flashing with error messages. At the center of the chaos stood Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a lead scientist with decades of classified projects under her belt. She watched the mayhem with a mix of anger and dread. "How did it get out?" she demanded, slamming a hand on the console. One of the technicians stammered. We don't know, Dr. Shaw. The containment field failed after the object started transmitting. It called something." Shaw's jaw clenched. She turned to the security officer standing nearby. "Lock down the perimeter. I want every resource we have tracking it, and get me Langford." The officer nodded and hurried out. Shaw turned back to the screen, where a grainy image of the forest clearing flickered. The creature, though gone, had left traces, energy signatures, and they were moving. Back on Route 206, the black SUV had closed the distance. Its headlights suddenly flared to life, flooding the sedan with blinding light. Danny flinched, and Chris cursed under his breath. "They're not backing off," Danny said, panic creeping into her voice. "Hold on," Chris growled, yanking the wheel to the right. The sedan veered onto a narrow, unmarked road, its tires skidding on loose gravel. The SUV followed, its engine growling like a predator in pursuit. The road twisted sharply through dense woods, the sedan's headlights cutting through the dark. Chris pushed the car as fast as it would go, the engine protesting loudly. The SUV stayed close, its lights bouncing in the mirrors like a pair of glowing eyes. Ahead, the road split into two paths. Chris had no time to think. "Left or right?" he shouted. "Right," Danny yelled. Chris took the turn, the car lurching as the tires struggled for grip. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following, its speed relentless. "Chris, this is insane," Danny cried. "We're not going to lose them like this." Chris's mind raced. The forest pressed in on them, and the road showed no signs of letting up. Then he spotted something up ahead, a narrow bridge spanning a deep ravine. The old wooden structure looked barely stable. "Hold on tight," Chris said, flooring the gas pedal. The sedan shot onto the bridge, the wood creaking ominously under its weight. Chris prayed it would hold as the SUV barreled after them. Halfway across, Chris slammed the brakes and yanked the wheel to the side. The sedan skidded to a stop, blocking the bridge. "Are you crazy?" Danny screamed. Chris didn't answer. He grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the car. "Run," he barked, pulling her toward the ravine. The SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the bridge. The driver's door opened, and a man in a black tactical suit stepped out. His face was obscured by a mask, but his movements were calm and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Chris and Danny slid down the embankment, their shoes slipping on the loose dirt. They crouched behind a large boulder, hearts pounding as they watched the masked man approach the sedan. He inspected the vehicle briefly before stepping back and raising a small device. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air, making Chris and Danny wince. The sedan erupted into flames, the explosion lighting up the night. Danny clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Chris pulled her closer, his mind racing. Whoever these people were, they weren't just trying to scare them. They wanted them silenced. The man scanned the area, his head tilting slightly, as though listening for something. Chris held his breath, willing himself to be invisible. After what felt like an eternity, The man lowered the device and returned to the SUV. The vehicle reversed off the bridge and disappeared into the night. "We're alive," Danny whispered shakily, staring at the flaming wreckage of the sedan. "But now we're stranded." Chris's jaw tightened. Not for long. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. They were deep in the woods, far from any cell towers. "We need to keep moving. They'll come back once they realize we're not dead." Danny nodded reluctantly, and they started walking, sticking to the shadows. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. After what felt like hours, they stumbled onto a dirt path. A faint glow ahead caught their attention. They followed it cautiously and soon found themselves standing before an old cabin. The light came from a single oil lamp in the window. "We don't have much choice," Chris said, stepping toward the door. Danny grabbed his arm. "What if it's them?" Chris hesitated but shook his head. "We have to take the risk." He knocked on the door. For a moment, there was no response. Then it creaked open, revealing an older man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He looked them over, his expression unreadable. "You're not safe out here," the man said simply, stepping aside. "Come in." Chris and Danny exchanged a wary glance before stepping inside. The man shut the door behind them and locked it, his movements deliberate. "Who are you?" Danny asked. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's the wrong question. The question you should be asking is, what did you see tonight?" Chris and Danny froze, their fear deepening. The man leaned closer, his voice low. "Because whatever it was, it's not from here." The cabin was a chaotic mix of survivalist clutter and meticulously organized equipment. Maps of New Jersey covered the walls, dotted with red pins, concentric circles, and cryptic notations. A shortwave radio crackled faintly on a table, emitting bursts of static. Shelves were crammed with old books, many with titles referencing UFOs, government conspiracies, and extraterrestrial encounters. The man gestured for Chris and Danny to sit at the small, rickety table in the center of the room. He poured 3 cups of steaming black coffee from a battered percolator and slid them across the table. His hands were steady, but his expression betrayed a deep concern. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice low but urgent. "The lights, the thing." Chris hesitated, glancing at Danny. She nodded slightly, encouraging him to speak. "We saw something," Chris admitted. "A disc buried in the ground, and something came out of it. It wasn't human." The man's face hardened. He leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto Chris's. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." "Then tell us," Danny said, her voice trembling, "because someone just tried to kill us for seeing it." The man let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "My name's Alan Holt. Used to work at Picatinny Arsenal, Classified Research Division. 15 years ago, we found something buried deep under the arsenal, a structure unlike anything made on this planet." Chris sat up straighter. "You're saying it's alien?" Alan nodded grimly. "No doubt about it. The government's been studying it ever since, trying to reverse engineer the tech. But the structure isn't just tech, it's alive, in some way we don't fully understand." "Alive?" Danny asked, her voice incredulous. Alan tapped the side of his head. "It communicates, sends out signals. At first, we thought they were random, but then we realized they were coordinates." "Coordinates to where?" Chris asked. Alan's gaze darkened. "That's the problem. The places it pointed to, deep ocean trenches, remote mountain ranges, even under the Arctic ice, they all had similar structures. But the last set of coordinates, they didn't point to anywhere on Earth." A cold silence fell over the room. Chris could feel the weight of Alan's words settling on him like a stone. "What's happening now?" Danny asked. "Why is it active again?" Alan stood and walked to the maps on the wall. He pointed to a large red circle drawn over the Picatinny Arsenal and surrounding areas. 2 weeks ago, it started transmitting again. Stronger this time. Whatever it's calling for, it's getting a response. Chris's stomach churned. "That thing we saw tonight? Was it part of the response?" Alan nodded. "One of many. And it's not here to make friends." Miles away, in a dimly lit underground facility, Dr. Evelyn Shaw stood before a massive screen displaying a 3-dimensional model of the object buried beneath Picatinny Arsenal. Red alerts flashed across the screen, and technicians scrambled to contain the situation. A young analyst approached, his face pale. Dr. Shaw, we've confirmed multiple energy signatures converging on the New Jersey area. Whatever it called, they're arriving. Dr. Shaw's lips pressed into a thin line. Evacuate all non-essential personnel. Lock down every facility within a 50-mile radius, and activate the fail-safe protocol. The analyst hesitated. Ma'am, if we activate the protocol, I said do it, Shaw snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. If we lose containment, this won't just be a local incident, it'll be global. Back in the cabin, Danny paced anxiously, her arms wrapped around herself. So what do we do now? We can't just wait for them to find us. Alan opened a drawer and pulled out a large envelope. He slid it across the table to Chris. These are the locations of every known site connected to the structure. If you're serious about exposing the truth, you'll need to follow the trail. Chris opened the envelope, revealing a series of photos and coordinates, along with handwritten notes and a hurried scrawl. This is a lot, Chris murmured. Why are you giving this to us? Alan smirked faintly. Because I'm already a dead man walking. They know I've been leaking information. But you two, you still have a chance to get out of this alive. Before Chris could respond, a low hum filled the air, rattling the cabin's windows. Alan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for a rifle propped against the wall. They've found us, he said, his voice sharp. Get to the basement. Now. Chris and Danny didn't argue. They followed Alan to a trapdoor in the floor, which he threw open to reveal a narrow staircase leading into darkness. As they descended, the hum grew louder, interspersed with bursts of static that sounded almost like whispers. In the basement, Alan yanked a heavy lever on the wall. Metal shutters slid down over the cabin's windows above, sealing them in. He handed Chris a flashlight and motioned toward a workbench covered in tools and weapons. If they get through, you'll need to defend yourselves, Alan said. Danny's eyes widened. Defend ourselves against what? As if in answer, the ground above them shook violently, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. Alan glanced at Chris, his face grim. Whatever's out there isn't human, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. The ground trembled as the deafening roar above subsided into a strange, rhythmic vibration. The basement felt like a cage, every sound amplified, every second dragging. Chris clutched the flashlight in one hand and a wrench from the workbench in the other, his knuckles white. Danny leaned against the cold concrete wall, her breath shallow and quick. Alan, rifle at the ready, stared up at the ceiling, his jaw tight. They're scanning, he muttered. Scanning for what? Chris asked, his voice barely audible. For us, Alan replied grimly. They don't need eyes to see. They can feel heat, movement, even fear. Danny's legs buckled slightly and she slid down the wall into a crouch. This can't be real, she whispered. I just wanted to help you chase a weird story, Chris. Not this. Chris knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this, okay? We just have to stick together. Alan cut them off with a sharp wave of his hand. Quiet. The rhythmic vibration above turned into sharp, metallic thuds, as though something heavy was walking across the roof of the cabin. The sound was deliberate, unhurried. Whatever was out there wasn't in a rush. Then came the voice. It wasn't a single voice but a chorus, layered and alien, speaking in a language that sounded like static and guttural tones. The air in the basement seemed to grow heavier with every word. They're trying to get in our heads, Alan said, his voice tight. Ignore it. Don't listen. Chris fought the urge to cover his ears as the voice grew louder, almost melodic in its cadence. For a fleeting moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to open the trapdoor and step outside. His hand drifted toward the stairs, but Danny's frantic grip on his wrist snapped him back to reality. Chris, she hissed. What are you doing? I don't know, he stammered, shaking his head violently. It's like they were pulling me. Alan cursed under his breath. They're good at that. You need to fight it. They don't just take your body, they take your mind. Suddenly, the metallic thud stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. The three of them froze, straining to hear any sign of movement. Then, the trapdoor above them creaked. Danny's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. Alan swung his rifle toward the stairs, his finger hovering over the trigger. Chris turned off the flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for the faint glow of emergency lights along the basement floor. The trapdoor creaked again, its hinges groaning as it slowly opened. A faint, otherworldly light spilled down the stairs, casting long, unnatural shadows on the walls. Chris's heart hammered as the rhythmic hum returned, softer now, almost gentle. A silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs, tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure didn't move, but the hum grew louder, resonating in Chris's chest like a second heartbeat. Alan didn't hesitate. He fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The figure flinched but didn't fall. Instead, it stepped onto the first stair, the hum shifting to a sharp, piercing tone that made Chris's vision blur. "They're adapting," Alan shouted, firing again. This time, the figure staggered back, its body flickering like static on a broken screen. It let out a sound, a cross between a scream and a grinding of metal that made Danny clap her hands over her ears. The figure retreated up the stairs, the trapdoor slamming shut behind it. Alan lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. "They're testing us," he said. "Next time, they'll come in force." "Next time?" Danny snapped, her voice shrill. "What do you mean next time? We need to get out of here." Alan shook his head. "You don't understand. They're not just after us. They're after the information we have. Those coordinates you're carrying, they'll kill to make sure no one sees them." Chris pulled the envelope of photos and coordinates from his jacket pocket, staring at it like it was a bomb. "Why? What's so important about these sites?" Alan hesitated, as though debating whether to tell them. The structures at those sites, they're not just remnants of alien tech. They're connected, like nodes in a network, and the one at Picatinny is the hub. Danny's eyes widened. "The hub of what?" Alan's expression darkened. "A gate." Meanwhile, back at the Picatinny arsenal, Dr. Evelyn Shaw stood in the control room, watching a live feed of the forest outside the facility. Drones buzzed through the trees, scanning for heat signatures and movement. The energy readings on the main monitor spiked again, higher than before. "Ma'am," a technician called, "we've detected another signal burst. It's not just broadcasting coordinates anymore, it's triangulating." Dr. Shaw's blood ran cold. "Triangulating what?" The technician's hands flew across his keyboard. "It's locked onto multiple objects moving toward this location. Energy signatures match the ones we've been tracking." Shaw leaned closer to the screen. "How many?" The technician hesitated. "All of them." Back in the cabin, Alan was packing supplies into a small backpack. "You can't stay here," he said, his tone clipped. "They'll come back, and next time they won't stop at testing." Chris helped Danny to her feet. "Where do we go?" Alan handed him a slip of paper. "This address. It's an old safe house in the Pine Barrens. There's a tunnel system there we used during the early experiments. It should still be intact." "What about you?" Danny asked. Alan gave her a grim smile. "Someone has to stay and make sure they follow the wrong trail." Chris opened his mouth to protest, but Alan cut him off. "No time to argue. Go, and whatever you do, don't stop for anything." As Chris and Danny climbed out of the basement and into the night, the rhythmic hum began again, louder this time. They ran toward the edge of the woods, the faint glow of the horizon, their only guide. Behind them, the cabin erupted in a blinding flash of light, followed by an earth-shaking roar. Chris and Danny sprinted through the dark forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the brilliant light of the explosion faded, but the rhythmic hum returned, louder and closer. Shadows danced erratically as alien figures flickered in and out of sight among the trees. Danny clutched Chris's arm. "We can't outrun them, Chris. What do we do?" Chris's mind raced. He pulled the envelope from his jacket and stared at the coordinates inside. Alan had sacrificed himself for this information. It had to mean something, something that could end this nightmare. He shoved the papers back into his pocket and grabbed Danny's hand. "We head for the Pine Barrens," he said. "If that tunnel system is still there, it's our best shot." They emerged from the woods onto a desolate road. The moonlight reflected off Danny's terrified face as Chris flagged down an approaching vehicle. A battered pickup truck. The driver, a wiry man with a suspicious glare, rolled down the window. "You two look like hell. What's going on?" he asked, his eyes narrowing at the desperation in their voices. "No time to explain," Chris said, pulling the envelope out as proof of urgency. "We need a ride to the Pine Barrens, now." The man hesitated, but finally motioned for them to get in. As the truck roared down the road, Chris and Danny kept looking over their shoulders. The hum had receded, but they knew better than to feel safe. "What's so important about the Pine Barrens?" the driver asked. "It's where this ends," Chris muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The truck screeched to a halt near the edge of the barrens, where the dense forest gave way to open land. Chris and Danny jumped out, thanking the driver before racing into the undergrowth. They followed the coordinates Alan had given them, weaving through gnarled trees and ankle-deep sand until they reached a rusted metal hatch half buried in the ground. Chris yanked it open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Danny hesitated, looking back toward the forest. The hum was returning, louder than before, accompanied by flashes of light in the trees. "They're coming!" Danny cried. Chris grabbed her hand and pulled her down the stairs, slamming the hatch shut behind them. The tunnel was damp and suffocating, lit only by faint emergency lights flickering every few feet. "What are we even looking for?" Danny asked, her voice trembling. "A way to stop them," Chris said. "Alan said these places are connected, part of some kind of network. If we're at the hub, there has to be a way to shut it down." Deeper in the tunnel, the walls began to shimmer with the same liquid metal quality they had seen on the disc in the clearing. The hum became almost deafening, reverberating through their bodies. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber. At the center of the room stood a towering, crystalline structure, pulsating with light and energy. Strange symbols flickered across its surface, shifting like they were alive. It felt ancient, yet impossibly advanced. Danny stared in awe. "This is it, isn't it? The hub." Chris approached cautiously, his heart pounding. He reached for his camera but stopped when a voice echoed through the chamber. It was the same alien chorus they'd heard at the cabin, only now it was clear, almost human. "Leave. This is not your fight." Chris froze. "What do you mean, not our fight? You've been hunting us. You trespass. The gate must remain closed." Chris exchanged a look with Danny. "The gate? It's a portal, isn't it? To somewhere else." "To everywhere," the voice replied. "It must not open." Before Chris could respond, the chamber shook violently. The walls rippled like water, and a fissure of light split the crystalline structure. From it, more of the alien figures emerged, their liquid metal bodies glinting as they surrounded the pair. Danny clutched Chris's arm. "They're not here to talk, Chris." Suddenly, one of the aliens paused, its glowing eyes narrowing on the envelope in Chris's hand. It stepped forward and reached out, its voice softer now. "The map. Give it to us." Chris gripped the envelope tighter. "Why? So you can keep this hidden forever?" The alien tilted its head. "To stop the others. They are coming, more dangerous than us." Danny stared at the creature, her fear giving way to a flicker of understanding. "Chris, I think they're trying to protect us." Chris hesitated, the weight of the envelope in his hand suddenly unbearable. These coordinates, this network, it wasn't just a threat to Earth. It was a threat to everything. Reluctantly, he held out the envelope. The alien took it, its touch surprisingly gentle. The alien turned to the structure, raising its arms. The chamber trembled as the fissure in the crystal began to close, the light dimming. The hum grew fainter, then stopped entirely. One by one, the alien stepped back into the crystal, disappearing as the structure sealed itself. The chamber fell silent. Back on the surface, the sky was clear, the strange lights and drones gone. Chris and Danny stood at the edge of the Pine Barrens, the weight of what they'd experienced pressing down on them. "Do you think it's over?" Danny asked softly. Chris shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever they were protecting us from, I hope we never have to find out." In the depths of space, far beyond Earth, a dark, pulsating mass stirred. It shifted, sending out signals of its own, as though aware of what had just transpired. The gate was closed for now. But it wouldn't remain that way forever. The end.